Hello, this is Eric Deinzer, and welcome to the Nuke 222 Guerrillas Guide from the Trenches course. This is class number one, and to start off, what you can see here is we've got a rig and wire removal that's pretty significant and pretty hard to do, I think. So I figure this is a great way to get started. It's a lot of material, certainly for this video, this class here, but there's probably going to be quite a bit of material for class number two as well. This piece of footage that we're looking at and this rig and wire removal will take the first two classes. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do, we have, of course, the two cables. So the first part is going to be just very easy. We're just going to knock out the cables over the green screen and fill those in with green. And then after that, we will do something that is, I think, very cool, which is we're going to do a series of morphs where the cable drifts over this piece of skirt material, which is kind of lacy and semi-transparent. So it's about 10 frames where it drifts through. The way that I think is best to attack this is by doing a series of morphs and blending those together. And that should take up the entire class. Then for the assignment, my goal is to have you folks finish out on this ScreenWrite cable, do the same approach for this piece of skirt in here. So there's quite a bit to do. It's going to be tough to fit this into a 40-minute time frame, but I'm going to do my best. With that said, just a few quick things about getting started. I'm going to set up our frame range from 1001 to, I think this is a 50 frame shot. So it'd be 1001 to 1051, like so. And I will also, another thing I'm going to do, which is important, is I'm hitting the script directory button, which of course adds this little Python code, which now will allow us to map the footage for the class in the from the root directory. So when you open up the project files, it should automatically map and you shouldn't have to relink anything. I understand that this might not work with Windows. So if for some reason it does not, feel free to let me know on the forums. I think that's all we need to do to get started. Oh, well, of course, with the footage, we need to now place it so that it starts on frame 1001. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started by doing a track. What we'll do is a track on this cable here, and then we will knock this out with Rotoshape. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a tracker. And I assume you folks all know about the changes in the new tracker for Nuke 7, so I'm not going to go through much of that. But let's see here. We're just going to go ahead and track from this point here. I had a chance to look at this a bit, so I kind of know where I'm going with this. Okay, running the tracker, and as you can see, especially if you look in the screen left corner, you can see that this actually sticks pretty darn well. In fact, well, I suppose we could refine this from here. So from 1043, we could potentially get in here and tweak this a little bit more. Here, if we go ahead and shrink our track window and then do this, maybe do an offset, something like this. So now we have a little bit of this pattern to work with, and frame forward. Yeah, this is going to work just fine. Sometimes I will just step forward just frame by frame, because when you do that, it actually does produce a little bit more accurate track from frame forward to frame backwards. So we now have our track. Next thing we'll do is just go ahead and create a rotoshape that carries out this here, and we'll link the tracker to the rotoshape. And so I'm just going to go ahead and pause down while I do that, and we'll go from there. Okay, so here I've created a quick rotoshape that I created on frame 1001, which is fairly large, but in the end, I went ahead and just expression linked it by command dragging from the transform tab from the transform of the tracker. And this, of course, allows it to follow pretty nicely. And then we still have a next another set of the cable here that kind of reveals itself towards the tail end of the shot. I figured that for this stuff in here, there's really no need for us to have a rotoshape while we have so little of the cable being visible in this section right here. So what we'll do is just create a rotoshape on the tail end of the shot, and we'll do an expression link also, but I'm going to show you a quick expression that allows it to zero out without having to create a second tracker like this where you set it to frame 1051. So to do this, what we'll do is just a quick rotoshape to get rid of this section of the cable. And then I'm going to turn this off so this doesn't get in the way. Okay. And some of this might be rudimentary to you, I'm not sure, but this is something that I think is pretty useful if you have to use it. Now that we've created this at the tail end of the shot, if we were to just simply expression link the tracker from this transform tab to the rotoshape transform tab, of course it would then shift this off by 9 pixels and minus 14 pixels in the Y. So if we do this, you'll see right away that it does that. It shifts it and it's not lined up. But the easiest solution to this is just to copy the expression and subtract it from itself at the frame number you're at. And that will zero it out. And if we do that for the second one, by the way, I'm hitting the equals key to get into the expression. Then now we have them zeroed out. Of course, we could have easily done this by just taking the translate and expression linking at the root. Then anytime we created a rotoshape thereafter, it would also stick. But for this purposes of just showing you that nifty little expression, I decided to do it that way. Now that we have this, we can now take this rotoshape that we don't need at the front end of the shot by here. We can then just go ahead and turn this off, so we can just keyframe the opacity. I think here, let's take a look. If we wanted to disappear maybe right about there, so we'll just go ahead and set this to 0, and then 1 frame forward we'll go ahead and turn it on. Now that we have this, a couple of things about the new Roto Paint node. If you notice, it defaults to alpha now, and what we want to do is either take these shapes and fill them with a background. Like we could easily take this background green screen, which is pretty evenly lit, or we could fill it with a color which is then sampled in this general area, which I think is going to be more accurate given the fact that with any green screen, if we gamma this down, you'll start to see there are changes in it, especially here. This is much darker and it won't line up quite as perfectly. And those are things that the keyer will have difficulty getting. So not that we're going to key this shot, but if somebody were to key it, that would create lines which would undoubtedly come through in the key. So the next step for us to do now is to just go through and keyframe the rotashapes and just make them line up, because as you can see, they kind of drift over and around the cable a little bit. But the bulk of the work has been done for us now that we have that track data linked to the rotoshape nodes, or the actual splines themselves. I'm going to go ahead and pause down for one more second and just clean up the animation on the splines. And once we're done with that, then we'll move on to the next step, which is going ahead and starting to create some clean frames from which we can then start doing the morphs. Okay, so I went ahead and keyframed all the roto so that it sticks a little bit better, and of course turned off the lower shape at right around, what is this, frame 1013, so it's now gone from that point forward. And then the next thing I did is filled it with a color. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So with this being active, you'll notice that nothing is coming through, even though Over here, I have sampled the color right around the green. And the reason why, and this is just a little gotcha, I'm trying to actually deselect that, but for some reason I'm having difficulty. But now, one of the cool things is that it defaults to alpha. However, if you don't switch that off and you do something different, like filling the shape with something other than white in the alpha channel, then it's not going to work quite right. So it's just something to be aware of. I'm not sure if you guys have been brought up to speed about the new UI changes. I'm not going to get into it too much because I think that most of you know what is different about Nuke 7 versus 6.3x. If for some reason there are questions, feel free to hit me up on the forums and I will respond to them right away. Now that we have this completed, let's take a look at the actual playback of this. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and let's expand the viewer. Actually, twirl that up. There we go. So now the nice thing is that the cable looks like it's pretty well gone, although I'm seeing a couple of hits actually right in here and other places, which I'll go ahead and clean up in time. But for the moment, let's keep moving forward so we can get through this. The important thing is this section of the skirt right here. So from 1034 all the way to 45, I think. And actually here, if we look at before and after, yeah. In fact, yeah, what is this? 1044 is the last frame. So yeah, all the way through 1045. So what we'll do is create a series of morphs from that frame range. And just a note about how we're going to do this. It's much better and more accurate if you create morphs that don't have to warp as hard. And what I mean by that is if we take this frame here and morph to say like this one or this one, we're going to have a much easier time as opposed to if we try to do one from here all the way to the end. There's no way you would be able to get it to warp right and make it look believable. So for us, this is why we're going to do a series of them. So I'm going to go ahead and take the next step here is just to paint a series of clean frames. So we'll just get rid of this green here and fill this in. And from there, then we'll start the morphing process. So now that we've done this, let's go ahead and start creating some clean frames. So the first thing that we want to do is grab, I think it was 1034, right? Okay, here we go. So this we can just go ahead and branch a frame hold off of. Frame hold, and we'll set this to 1034. Okay, 1034. And then what we'll do is create a paint node here on 1034 for which we can then just replace the bits that have been knocked out, which really in this particular case there's very little, so this is going to be quite easy. Then moving forward, I would say maybe 1036 or 1037. Yeah, 1037. This piece here doesn't seem to change too much from 1036 to 1030. Well, it gets a little fatter. Yeah, I think we can probably get away with this though. So it's going to be a 3-frame morph technically. So what I'm going to do is Option C and just duplicate this so we have it ready to go. And we'll set this one to 1037. Now let's start making up our clean frames. So let's go back to 1034. I'm just viewing through this frame hold here. And one thing that might help is if we branch off of the part that we have just cleaned up. And let's go ahead and take the secondary input or one of the secondary inputs on the paint node and we'll source those to the original. And the reason why we're doing this is just because if you look what's knocked out, especially in here, actually here, go here, you can see a lot of it is knocked out, whereas in the actual original plate, there's less that we would have to rebuild. So it's just going to make it easier on ourselves if we have this material to rebuild from. So let's move back to 1034 and we'll just simply paint out that little section of stuff there and fill this back in. Easiest way to do this, of course, is just a reveal from the background one. So let's turn this on, and instead of the clone, we'll take the reveal tool, and I'm sure this is all old hat. By the way, if you flip the pen over in the Wacom tablet, it actually does, if you notice over here, it does actually activate the eraser tool, which is pretty cool. I like that little nifty function. And then in here, I think perhaps we'll just, let's see. Yeah, it's really not much. Let's just fill this with some green and mix that to get rid of this kind of dark edge. So I'm going to hit the C key for the clone offset tool. And by default, it goes to the foreground source, which is exactly the same as the background. The only difference being that I'm going to expand the viewer so we can see our buttons. The only difference with foreground is that it does not allow you to change the source frame from what you're painting. So what I mean by that is if we go back here to foreground, all of that disappears, those options for the difference in time. So this delta T here, what that means is, of course, change in time. And then relative is the number of frames relative to where you are parked. So in this case, 1034. So if we wanted to sample from 1036, that would be 2. Now, there's another option, which is absolute. The equivalent to that would be then putting in 1036. So that's kind of a nice thing to know if you don't already know that. And let's see here. Click outside that box. And actually, let's go back to what we were trying to do, which was just do a clone offset. So I'm going to take this back to 0 relative. So we're going to be just cloning from the original frame that we're on. And let's just do this. And we'll start painting that out. Okay. And that looks pretty good. Yeah, that's going to be fine. And if we wanted to get a little more technical, we could actually soften. We could paint some of this back in, so you're actually putting in some yellow. There. Yeah, nice. Okay, so that was easy. Of course, the other ones are not going to be so easy. So let's go to 1037 and look at that one. I'm actually going to name this RotoPaint node 1034, so I know when it's in the control panels bin which paint node I'm actually painting with, because sometimes I can get confused anyway when I've got multiple paint nodes and I don't know which one's which. So that's usually handy. And here we go. So RotoPaint 1037 once again. And now with this, let's look at the original plate. So that here is 1037. So we need to fill in a fair amount of stuff, but we can get it certainly from 1035 and certainly by 1038, 10 or 1039, excuse me. So we'll go ahead and paint that stuff in from there. So let's go back to 1037. And mind you, I'm just doing a single frame paint on these frames, and the frame hold will obviously carry that through. So that's why I put this paint node before the frame hold, so that way we don't have to set the time, the lifetime of the strokes to all, which saves a little bit of CPU power and confusion as well. Now, let's let's take a look here. So let's go ahead and grab from 1035. So we're going to take background 1, since that's basically the one that has the most material, and I'm going to expand the viewer so we can see our buttons better. Also, this gear here shows you your translate, rotation, and also the filtering type, which is sometimes useful if you want sometimes crisper paint strokes that match to the plate better. There are a lot of people that prefer the Riffman algorithm, but for this case, I think cubic will be fine. Also, this round is round to pixel, so basically what it will do, which is not so important for us because our footage is actually digital from the Red Epic camera, and there's no grain whatsoever, so we're not going to have to worry so much about this. But especially with film plates where you have grain, if you have this checked off and you're doing sub-pixel painting, especially when this filtering system is set to cubic, you'll see a lot of softening in the grain, and that can, be kind of a problematic issue if you then need to degrain and regrain in the process to get it to look right. So now that we have this, I'm going to go back here to RGB and let's get started. So we're going to take from 1035, I think I said, and since I actually said the frame number, I'm just going to use absolute. And let's do this here, which is the onion skin. Now, if you haven't used this, this is something that a lot of people don't use from what I've seen, and I think it's underutilized because this really does allow you to do a lot of your painting in just the paint node, whereas a lot of artists that I know will actually branch off transforms and then plug those in and line those up. But the problem with doing that is that you need to add multiple inputs to the thing, which, you've got I think a total of 4 inputs, which is nice. But then once you've gotten a certain number of strokes, if you don't have the right transform set up, then that means you have to go and create another paint stroke with new transforms. So, to me, this is one of those case scenarios where if you use this, you can actually save yourself a lot of time. So what I'm doing here is this is the opacity slider. So this is, I'll get to why I like that so much in a minute. And then this, just by virtue of left mouse button clicking, you can see right away how this is lining up. So we'll line this peak with this peak up. And then the thing with the opacity slider that I like is if you have it at, say, 50% opacity and you move it and it looks like it's lined up perfectly, one of the things I've seen is that when I lay down a paint stroke, it doesn't line up exactly, but it helps if you actually slide the opacity slider and you see how your images change. So you can see this is kind of moving up a little bit. So maybe I might just scoot it back and down like a pixel. There, now it feels like it's right on. So by doing this, now we should be pretty much spot on for this section in here, which looks pretty good. Now I can see right here, this line should be down further. So why don't we move this, go back to the onion skin and see what we have here. So we need to move this down ever so slightly. And I think that's going to work. And a lot of times paint is a lot of that, where you just kind of, a lot of trial and error until you get it to look the way you want it to. Okay, let's go ahead and erase some of this. What did we get rid of? Well, actually, that's some of that errant shirt. But we'll do this, and then we also have some of this rig peeking through here again from that other paint stroke. Okay, and now that we have this. Actually, I'm going to gamma this down so this is a little easier to see. You can see that this doesn't line up right. So while I was talking about the ability to adjust your opacity slider, now the cool thing is if we didn't get it right, which we didn't in this case, we can now edit those paint strokes because of course this is vector based. So what I tend to do is go through and figure out which paint stroke it was, and it looks like it's this one here. So now that we have this, we can go over to the clone tab, and we can literally, there's two ways. You have this control jack, which will allow you to move it this way, which that's pretty cool because now that looks pretty lined up. Or you can just numerically up arrow or down arrow to make these things stick. And sometimes that can be a little bit more accurate. Okay, so looking at this, this is looking pretty good. Okay, there are some problems. You can see how this thing is shifting over now that I've done this. So because of that, I want to fix that. Also, this stuff down here seems to not be lining up either. So what we'll do is I'll go ahead and do the same process for which I just described and line this stuff up and probably grab from frame 1039 in this case. So we can get more of this over in here and maybe line some of this up a little bit better as well. While I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and pause down because I imagine we're burning up quite a bit of time on this class so far. So instead of wasting your time, I'm just going to go ahead and take care of it with the process that I just described. Okay. So I went ahead and finished painting the this frame here, 1037. And this is the first frame, 1034, and then this is 1037. And I think now at this point these look pretty good, and it feels like this should be able to morph together very simply and cleanly. So let's get started now on the morph. So having done this, let's just go ahead and hit Spline Warp, which is the new Spline Warp tool. And once again, there are a lot of UI changes to the new Spline Warp in Nuke 7. This is definitely a major improvement, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So as you know, over here in the output, this, or maybe you don't, excuse me, this here is the same as these buttons here. So if I click on this, you'll see you have the A warped, B warped, and AD morph. And subsequently, if you look here, those corresponding icons should make some sense. So we're looking at the A side, and given that there has been I've run into some issues with the new Spline Warp tool where the Bezier shapes will sometimes kind of explode and go corrupt, where the points go off into infinite space. I found that the best way to cover myself for situations like this is to create the initial shapes in just a RotoShape node. That way I have them if I need to copy and paste them back into the Spline Warp node later. At least they're there, as opposed to doing it all in here and then subsequently having them go corrupt and haywire on you. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and create a shape that kind of goes around here, and we'll just go ahead and paste that into the Spline Warp node for the A side. Okay. And since you don't need to see me do this, I'm just going to go ahead and pause and come back. Okay, so here it is, the shape on frame 1034, and that looks pretty good. I don't think we need to get much of this stuff in here because the nature of our patch that we're morphing is going to be just where the cable is. This should blend in just fine with the rest of the skirt. Now that I've created this in the RotoShape node, I want to show you something that's pretty cool, and that's if you hold down your Option key and literally drag in, it will copy it into the Spline Warp node. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and turn this off. And for the sake of making sure I know what I'm looking at, I'm just going to name this Bezier for the frame number. So it's Bezier 1034 for the A side. And you'll notice in here it gives you an A reference. That's basically which pipe it's now tagged to. And now that we've done this, if we go ahead and go over to the B side and we now copy this, we can duplicate that shape into B, and then we should be, yep, there it is. Now we have, let's not put any extra Beziers in there. Now we have this shape that is now B, which is blue for the B side. Another thing to note, which I just realized I haven't addressed, is this auto key here. Since we're just simply doing a morph, these shapes do not need to move. It's good practice to turn this off, because if you end up with extra keyframes, it's just, extra work that you have to, clean up later. So I'm turning that off. So now we're not going to have keyframes all over the place when we start adjusting the shapes. So here we have it. Let's just go ahead and now take this shape, which is pretty close, and just adjust it so that it lines up with our B-side image, which is frame 1037. Okay, now that we have this set up, the next step, if you look at our two shapes, they match up pretty well. So the next step is to join these two shapes. And while I've done this, I'm also going to name that. So let's go to the AB morph view, which now brings up both shapes. And then the next step here is to click this join tool right here. And if we just literally drag from the red to the blue, this is actually very important, and then click on the blue, we now have joined these two shapes. After you do that, click over here and we'll go to either the modify or add correspondence point. I like this one because it does has dual functionality. It allows you to adjust the correspondence points, but it also allows you to add them as well. So if you can see, when we go from the A to the warped A, you can see this is not lining up the way we want. So we're going to go ahead and adjust this so these things look right. So I'm going to just go ahead and add a few more correspondence points in here. And actually, if we expand the viewer, you can see here, now we know that this is going to want to line up with that. And this, of course, with that edge there. And then we have this edge. Well, let's see, can we do it? Yep, that works. Once you've actually started adding the points, it doesn't matter which tangent or which shape you actually click on. So you can click on either the blue or the red, the source or the destination, and you'll be able to add them just the way you imagine. Okay, so now that I've got a series of correspondence points, I suppose the next thing, just to kind of refine this so that we know that it looks right. And here I'm going to turn off my overlays and just see how that kind of plays back. And by the way, the A warped is going to be the exact same as the AB morph currently, because we haven't done the dissolve or anything like that. So this is just the warped version. And actually that feels pretty natural in terms of kind of banging back and forth. And let's see how it compares to the B. And there's still a little bit of warping that goes on to get to the B, but that's, yeah, okay. So here we go. So A, there we go. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then the B, yeah, here we go. Nice. Okay, so this should blend in just fine. Now that we have this, the next step is for us to go ahead and create the actual morph. So we know that we want to do it from 1034 starting. So we'll go ahead and set the root warp to 0. and then we want it to land on 1037. So at 1037, it's going to be 1. Now, from what my experience has been, the crucial part is getting the animation of the mix to take place after the warp. So what I tend to do is just like one frame to send the mix over, 1 or 2 frames, because if you do it through the entire warp, you're going to end up with kind of double edges here and there because it doesn't line up exactly. They're the same. So I'm going to do the mix starting. I'm going to just start with doing it from the second to the last frame and landing on the last frame. And now that we have this, let's go ahead and preview this and see what it looks like. Just go ahead and take our, so from 1034 to 1037. It's going to be very quick, but yeah, that feels okay. Yeah, all right, there we go. So now that we have that, we now have our first morph. And the next step, this is pretty cool. There's this thing called the cookie cutter. And when you click on this star icon, it will activate this here, which is an output, a mask, or basically a channel for those shapes that we just created. So if we go over here to the mask spline warp, you'll notice that we actually now have an alpha channel that we can then send to comp this over our painted frame. So let's do that. Cool. And so now we're going to go ahead and take this mask spline warp from the A side, and we also want to retain our RGB channels. So I'm going to click these for the B. So, okay, my Wacom tip doesn't work too well sometimes. Okay, here we go. Now that we've done this, if we go ahead and look at our RGBA and you look at the alpha channel, you can now see we have an alpha channel associated with our morphed image, and it's only the portion that we ended up morphing. So this is actually a really cool feature that I like. And just to finish up on this morph thing, one of the other things that we never really went into was creating a boundary shape. And the reason for doing something like this is just to simplify the processing time. If you have machines that are a little slower, and actually let's kill one of them because we only need one. Since we're in the morph option, when you created a shape, it creates them in both A and B. But for this, all we want is just one shape. And if you click over here, this now converts this to a hard boundary. By the way, this icon here, which you'll see also noted up in here as well, this relates to the hard boundary, and this one here relates to a soft boundary. So both of which can be useful if you want the boundary to kind of taper off versus, obviously something that just stops abruptly. But since we're only using the alpha channel here, we don't really need to worry too much about whether or not it's a hard or a soft boundary, because it's this is the only information that we're concerned with. So at this point, I went ahead and finished up another spline warp, essentially duplicating the whole process that we did here. So like I mentioned earlier, just branching off of 1037, and then I found that 1039 was actually a good, let's go ahead and frame the viewer, was a good frame to look at and to warp from. So if you look at from 1037 to 1039, it warps pretty well. And of course, you can see, the boundary shape, of course, is not moving anything else, but this here is the crucial area. And if we look at the node graph here, you'll notice that we have essentially the same thing. Now, one of the things that I had noted earlier also was this in the first spline warp, or morph, if you will, there was this jump in the horizontal line, which I thought was an errant paint stroke. But in fact, it turns out that this moves kind of independently from the rest of the material because it's just due to the depth of this material. It actually moved differently. So what I ended up doing is creating a single unclosed line, essentially. And to do that, I can demonstrate that here in just a moment. Actually, why don't I demonstrate that right now? So on this particular frame here, if I were to look at the A side and just create a line like so, and then hit the escape key, that actually finishes the line. So this is different from the RotoShape node where you actually have to close it. And when you do this, then you can just duplicate in B like I did. And if we look at the morph, you can see that basically I just duplicated this in B and then did the same process of joining the two lines and then adjusting adding a couple of correspondence points in the middle here so that it flows together. And I did that initially on this first spline warp where we were having the problem, and then continued that on the second one as well. So with that, I believe, and then just to finish this out, I added another add mix. So while this one drops off at 1038, I then continued, like you would expect from 1030, actually, yeah. So 1037 is technically the last frame of this one. And I pick it up where this one's also at 1037. Technically, these are exactly the same at 1037 because we are taking, in this case, landing on the B of this line warp. This is the B image, and the A image being the unwarped A on 1037. Hopefully that makes sense. And then continuing on. So with that process in mind, just taking this add mix and fading it on at exactly the same point from which this ends, then we're able to carry it through. So now if we look at the final output of this, you'll see that this should look pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and expand the viewer. And actually we can go back to our original kind of color space without it being gammaed down. And actually, one other thing I might want to do, since it ends on 1039, so we can now see it. You can see now the cable is going, you can see where the cable, you can see the soft faint edge where the cable was going. And it feels pretty natural the way this shakes and moves forward. So this essentially gets us to, well, like I said, 1039. So there's probably 2 more warps or morphs that we need to do to get it to 1044. And that would finish out this screen left section. And I can, when I send this out, I think I'll probably go ahead and continue building this out. But in the interest of just finishing this video in our allotted time, I just thought I would show you this, blueprint for which I would finish this out. With that being said, if you can, go ahead and try and get the second half of this, which is this side here, with all the concepts that we just hammered out, and see if you can finish it out to 1051. So I think that that's very doable, and by all means, hit me up with any questions you might have. I'll be checking the forums, and I will respond as soon as I possibly can. That concludes Class 1, and I look forward to Class 2, and thank you very much.